may not lead to overheating. The main argument Paul makes is that the spending won't take place this year, but will take place in subsequent years. And so the demand will take place in subsequent years. I think we all mostly expect that we will put COVID in the rearview mirror by the end of 2021, and that we will have a really quite strong economy at the end of 2021. And therefore, if there's more spending on one thing, there'll be less spending on another. And I would rather we run an economy targeted towards public investment in 2021 and 2022 and the subsequent years, rather than that we run an economy towards further spend out from people who got money, that people in state and local governments who got money that they didn't really need during 2021, but spent it out during 2022 and 2023. I'm focused on keeping room for the public investments that Paul and I agree are essential. I don't think it's a very strong argument to say sometimes the Fed was behind the curve and we got inflation, and sometimes the Fed overdid it and we got recession. Therefore, we should assume that the Fed will, on average, get it right and be able to keep things under control. I think the way to read that experience is that if we produce a very substantial overheat, the likelihood and the situation around the dollar and the fact that part of the story around GameStop is so-called stimmies from stimulus checks reinforces these concerns. I think the likelihood is that something adverse will happen, and therefore it's better not to do that experiment. So it seems to me that much the more prudent approach is to do exactly what Paul says is appropriate, which is to meet the need for this emergency in a generous way through this year, while at the same time planning for and providing economic support for things that will create jobs, help those who are disadvantaged, but also build the economy's capacity and create the wherewithal for more debt. So I'd like to see $1 trillion of public investment built into a $2 trillion program or a $2.5 trillion program to be legislated right now, rather than having by far the largest program in American history, whose advocates like Paul recognize that a very substantial part of it is in that third category, that is neither necessary to meet the emergency nor to provide relief for the suffering.
Thanks, Larry. So let me come back to Paul, and I would like to throw some additional element in it, which is politics, and Paul alluded to this already beforehand. How important do you think, Paul, is it that, you know, the Obama administration, when it came in, we had a huge financial crisis and the stimulus was too small at that time. And then when the elections came 2 years later, the Democrats were essentially voted out. And, you know, and then there was still enough money left for a Trump tax cut, which was very generous. And then we realized in Nairo, the inflation was not popping up. So this experience from the last crisis, to what extent is this shaping now the political debate in Congress among the parties? What's your take on this? And is this trumping the economic reasoning? Is this the political things saying, okay, in 2 years' time, we would like to keep the majority the Democrats would like to keep the majority in the Senate and the House?
Okay, let me come to that in a second. I want to talk just about two substantive economic issues. First is, yes, if we're over, actually, three issues amongst the economic issues. first of all, it's not just the specific. I mean, the shots in arms is what Larry talked about, and that's a big slug of stuff. But also there's quite a lot of spending on other things, notably education, basically virus proofing schools, and that's very much actually that is a form of long-term investment, because getting kids back to in-person learning as soon as possible is an investment thing, very probably more important than any kind of infrastructure. But still, there is probably quite a lot of air in this stuff that is not really well targeted on people in need. On the other hand, trying too hard to make stuff well targeted, we're not able to make a very precise cut there. So a certain amount of stuff that is kind of scattered, maybe scattershot, with only some of it falling on the people who are most in need is okay. Now the question there then becomes, well, but isn't that setting up for excess demand the next few years? For what it's worth, I think of that as just an increase in household wealth, and the marginal propensity to spend out of wealth is not 0.5, it's something like 0.1 or less. So it's something that's going to be spread over an extended period. It's not a 2022 issue. It's a next decade issue. I know it's liquid, but it's still, and of course there, GameStop, yeah, people spending their stimmies. There's always going to be some of that. About the Fed, my read, when I tried to come up with something that looks comparable in scale to what I think the actual fiscal stimulus is going to be, I actually come up with the Reagan tax cuts and military buildup of the early 80s. And of course, what's hard there is that you had layered on top of that was the Volcker recession. So a very tight monetary policy, which was instituted before the tax cuts, led to a severe recession and then was relaxed, and you had Morning in America. But if you actually ask what happened after that, which was a situation where tight monetary policy was in effect trying to offset fiscal stimulus, it actually worked. We had basically a soft landing in 84, 85, and nothing terrible happened. Now you can go through it, but the experience of the 80s, which is the most dramatic tight money thing that we see, but the story about tight money causing a recession is one that's before the fiscal stimulus. My read on that is that the Fed actually managed to handle the fiscal stimulus pretty well. Marcus, politics, of course, that hangs over everything. In fact, the reason why at some level Larry and I are having a purely academic debate, this thing is going to pass, and it's going to pass with a number very close to 1.9 trillion. And it's going to pass that way, and it's going to include a bunch of checks that are where the economic case is a bit weak. And the reason is because the checks are enormously popular. Democrats were badly burned by the experience of the Obama years, where an underpowered stimulus helped to lead to a Republican takeover of Congress. It's political stuff is just incredibly fraught. I mean, we're kind of mostly, I hope, in an insurrection-free zone here, but when you take a look at who the other party is and the urgency of doing stuff that is popular, especially when you've kind of promised it. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Democrats hold the Senate in large part because their two candidates in Georgia promised people $2,000 checks. Wisely or not, as you know, the fact is the party is not going to go back on that. So yeah, the politics overhangs it. Now, I don't like that. I want to be a technocrat and not be thinking about what's going to move. But this is it's, I feel like a classic villain here. This is real life. You can't handle the truth. The fact of the matter is, the economic policy has to be contingent on the fraught political situation.
Thanks, Paul. Let me pick up on the 1980s. Of course, the 1980s, we had a high nominal interest rate. And I was just wondering whether, Larry, you could outline a little bit, and Paul can come back to this as well. What are the implications of hiking the interest rates? Will there be a soft landing, as Paul said? But I'm worried in the sense that, if you look at the 30-year mortgage rate, it's roughly 2.7%, inflation 2%. So it's really, half a percentage point of a real interest rate on mortgages for 30 years. And there would be, if the rate were to go up, the real rate goes up, what happens then to all the asset prices? There will be a huge reallocation on the financial markets. And what happens to the emerging market economies? Now, what happens if the US were forced to raise interest rates to some extent? What are the repercussions for the rest of the world? Perhaps if you can elaborate on that, on the implications of the exchange rate and the emerging economies in particular.
Let me just say that I think Paul makes a case that there can be some air. I think it's hard to get the conclusion that you're not talking about $1 trillion of